welcome to another episode of War and Words, a podcast by the Conflict Law Center. Today we are very happy to have with us Bette Dam, who wrote this amazing book, Looking for the Enemy, Mullah Omar and the Unknown Taliban. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
As an introduction for all of you, Bette Dam is a Dutch investigative journalist who has worked in Afghanistan, Syria and Iraq. She is currently a lecturer at Sciences Po in Paris on the subject of Afghanistan. She has also written A Man and a Motorcycle, How Hamid Karzai Came to Power. So to start off, and for the benefit of the viewers at home, could you just talk briefly about the book, what led you to write it, the whole process, and what it's about?
Okay, so this book is about the former leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, a man who in the 20 years of so-called war on terror in Afghanistan, we did not know anything about.
Right, yeah.
No picture, not a verified picture. And at the same time, it was the most written about person.
Yeah.
Because every day there was a Taliban attack. So after Karzai's book, The Man and the Motorcycle is about how that president, Hamid Karzai, came to power in 2001. And in that story, I already figured that this whole idea of black and white, the government of Afghanistan, our Western allies are the good and the Taliban are bad, was falling apart immediately. And that made me think, if the enemy is not so clear cut, and who is the enemy then?
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, this is the only book about him. And that tells you a little bit about how, like say, legacy media from the New York Times to the French media or the Dutch media report on the enemy of the West. And I think that that is also indirectly what the book is about. When you go along with me searching for this man, Mullah Omar, because that's the whole book. It's a big search. It's a sort of detective. You follow me, and we see what we find.
Yeah, and I think that was what was so interesting about it, was that you were actually there in Afghanistan looking for remnants of it. I remember reading the bit where you're like, there's no picture or photo. And I'm like, really? I swear I've seen a photo. It was so dominating in our psyche that you almost feel like, no, of course this is a known person. But it really wasn't. What we knew about him was so limited. Yeah. And the fact that this is the first book actually solely about him, given how much has been written about Afghanistan, that to me really shows, what does it show to you? For me, it's the issue of being a war reporter, in the sense of like, is it lazy journalism? What is it?
Oof.
I know.
That is my PhD, because immediately after I finished this one, I wanted to answer this question.
Okay.
Like, what? Actually, what the are you doing? I'm so sorry.
We will have to bleep that out.
Okay, we will bleep that out. No, I was upset when I finished this, and I think why did we not cover it more properly? Why did we not try to have more access to the Taliban from the beginning? And that blows my mind now in the PhD I do now. Actually, we have a very free press in the West, in let's say America, because they are in the front line of coverage. They are the first gatekeepers. They are the most powerful gatekeepers in what you get to know when you wake up in the morning. And they are, they have a global audience. They are also very proud of saying our mission statement is providing news to the world, as the New York Times said in their missions and values list, so to say. And of course it's easy for them because they write in English, so there is automatically a sort of space they claim. But ooh la la, the real coverage is not global. The coverage on Afghanistan, we have analyzed now, both the New York Times and Associated Press, is ethically problematic.
Yeah.
Because it's an American affair. And so they claim that space in the global world. So people like the Afghan government read the newspaper as a sort of an authoritative newspaper, right? In Brussels, if you go with me to the European Commission, or I've done many times like these readings for the EU, and they say, but the New York Times says this. And I think that is Mullah Omar's profile made me think about that for the first time, and because I was in my own bias, I thought we really did a good job as Western journalists, and and is it laziness? It is a lot of things. It is easier. It's just easier to have an American ambassador in Kabul on the phone, and you can quickly say, despite the fact that he never went to Kandahar or to Ghazni, or is not an eyewitness, like these criteria for what is a good source. That I find a bit lazy.
Yeah,
honestly.
And also, whenever you meet Afghans in the West, I always ask, what tribe are you from? Because I can hear you rounding out your vowels. You are speaking Dari, you're not speaking Pashto. And it's a bit like, which tribe are we really listening to? Because we know that the Tajiks and the Uzbeks are generally going to be more pro-American. They're going to be more pro-Hamid Karzai than maybe Pashtuns. But which voices, even in Afghanistan, are you amplifying? Which ones aren't you? And I remember I only read Anand Gopal's book because it was the finalist for the Pulitzer, right? And so then I picked it up and I was like, this is phenomenal. It was brilliant. And I really put this book kind of with that, in the sense of, real stories from Afghanistan, from people who lived there and went there. Because if you are reporting from New York or London, how much do you actually know, and how much are you just getting from other people who are parroting other people? It's kind of like a chain link of, people who don't know but think that they know from reading stuff. And I think that is why books like this are so important in terms of rejecting some of the narrative. One of the things that I did want to explore was that you disagree quite a bit with Ahmed Rashid. And I want to talk to you about that, especially regarding the Pakistani state and the general assumption that the Pakistani state was so involved with the Taliban that it created them, and particularly with Mullah Omar. And could you talk to us a little bit more about that, in the sense of the fact that some of those myths you kind of bust in this, where you're just like, actually, he did not grow up in a Pakistani madrasa, not knowing anything about Afghanistan. That's totally ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a very strong narrative that the Americans call it AFPAC. I tell my students to get rid of that immediately, because
the hyphenation.
Indeed, because there are two countries and there's a lot of difference between them as well. And I do cross-check that idea coming from Washington DC, mainly, that the Pakistani state is in control of the Taliban and has also created the Taliban. And I knew about that narrative, but I flew in from a different perspective. I literally go first to Mullah Omar's youth, right? And I go to his school, his madrasa. I discover a whole madrasa system that nobody knew about at that time, and the Hujra system in the south.
I'd never heard of it before I read this.
I'm also sad about that. How come we don't know this about these traditions and what they actually learn, how non-political they are? Huh? There's nothing in Mullah Omar's education that was anti-Western.
Right.
So I go with him from these, from him being in these little hujras. It's like really poor, and poor education also. He's actually not a mullah also. He didn't finish it.
Right.
And he told that also to people, don't call me a mullah. And then we go with him from this life, quite a nice life, I think, in these little schools, to the first war. And that is when this Soviet Union / the United States find each other in Afghanistan. And I think what is important is that two things. in the group of Mullah Omar, that little fighting group that he is having around him, that group never changed. That group was also very important in the rise of the Taliban in 1994. So good friends, lived together, were neighbors. And they learned two things in these 10 years of fighting against the communism. And one, don't trust Pakistan, because Pakistan was dividing these weapons that the CIA and others, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and name it, were donating. And that went through the gatekeepers, and that was here in Pakistan. And that created a lot of tension. Because also Pakistan had a very political idea about who to support and who not to support. Another little detail which is completely wrong is that the Taliban were getting a lot of weapons at that time. Not true. It was the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar who got much more. And that in many ways, that's a whole different group from the Taliban.
Yeah. And
fascinating,
huh? Yeah, and it's so interesting because I didn't realize that was who we'd kind of parked ourselves after, and that's why they mistrusted us, because they were just like, well, you were hedging your bets with that guy.
Indeed. So the Taliban are ideologically quite different from the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar people. And there was actually the Taliban, the Taliban didn't like the Pakistanis in the sense of like their politics in the jihad. So there was a distrust created in a way. I also didn't see in the time of Mullah Omar, in his jihad time, I went to these villages where they were fighting and there were people still alive who were could explain like how the front lines were moving, where Mullah Omar was, where Mullah Brother was, and there was not a lot of names of Pakistanis involved. There was much more in the east, I feel. In the south, not so much. Now, and what the other thing is that the Taliban, like people like Mullah Omar, like these students, these Quran students, had a high esteem for the United States.
Oh, yeah, okay.
In the sense that when the communism came, the United States was their ally. Right. They provided the weapons. So Pakistan was gatekeeping them and adding some political leverage to that.
And I remember reading something which said that the US had the State Department had published something saying we think about 20 to 70% of the weapons we're giving are not going to Afghanistan from Pakistan. I was like, 20 to 70%, like, bro, what are you doing?
What is that for a weird statistic?
Yeah, that's, and the amount that you don't know, 20 to 70.
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off.
I have to think about Ukraine now.
Right, exactly. Right, yeah, because I was reading the other day because they were saying that some of those weapons are ending up on the black market in the hands of the Taliban, and I'm like, okay, right.
Yeah, it ends up in all sorts of hands.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I.
Yes. Yeah. So they were. Also, the United States. Remember, United States wanted an Islamic State in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That was for them the alternative to communism. So they supported people who were quite radical, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was quite anti-Western openly. And so, the Taliban was never so political. The Taliban, these Quran students who mostly did not finish their studies, who did not study in the madrasas, we need to actually rewrite some history on this, please, because it's better for peace.
Right.
In the end, if you want to be involved in the region here. The Taliban had just when they arrive in 1994 in Kandahar, and soon enough in the whole south, I write about the first delegation of the American embassy coming to Kandahar. And Mullah Omar is already very particular at that time, where he doesn't really want to meet strangers slash Westerners. It seems to be a bit blurred who he does meet and who he does, because later on he meets Westerners. But he sends his governor to this, and there's a cable about this meeting. And the first thing the governor, Hassan, his name is, says, when do you open the embassy in Kabul? We did what you want to do. We installed the Islamic State that you have been trying to install for 10 years, plus 4 years of civil war.
Right. Okay.
Because this influx of weapons made that everybody started to fighting each other, and so we ended up in this terrible situation of civil war. And so yeah, that's so when the rise of power of Mullah Omar, we don't have a lot of books about that. There is Mullah Saif has some ideas about it, but Mullah Saif was not present. That is the ambassador in Pakistan. Soon enough for Mullah Omar. So we don't have a lot of like eyewitnesses of like this little village, Haji Ibrahim, where things happen, where history changes, but they are not aware of it when they are in the middle of it, of course.
Right. Yeah.
And now, there is the big narrative also coming from Ahmed Rashid, is that soon enough the Pakistanis will be present in this small Haji Ibrahim and launch the Taliban as their puppets.
Okay.
And I say I have a different theory. I think there is a lot of distrust towards them. At that point, Pakistan is still supporting Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. They have no eyes on Kandahar so much. There is, on the other hand, the murky world of the drugs dealers.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And so we see that is cross-bordering, of course, this trade in opium. And there are big guys in it, big businessmen. Not new, not that's going on for a while, but yeah, and maybe that is looped in with some agencies, I don't know, but it's not that there's an Pakistani decision to launch the Taliban to take over that movement and direct it. And we have so many examples in the book where Mullah Omar says, no, I don't want this, Pakistan. No, I don't want this. And it seems to be that Pakistan has no leverage to intervene politically. The moment the Al-Rashid NGO comes with money to build mosques or another donation for installing telephone networks, that's fine. The Taliban has no problem with that.
Okay.
But do not get involved in any political decision of like we go left, we go right. That's to me a difference.
Yeah. And the bits I found myself tagging quite a bit are the bits where you're talking about the fact that a lot of killings were blamed on the Taliban when they weren't done by them. And it was just, internecine warlords fighting, or it was just revenge killings. And everyone was happy with the pat narrative of this is the Taliban, that's it, that's just what they do. And the fact that was a very palatable narrative, but you don't dig into what's actually going on or the people that you're allying with, and the fact that they're using this to launch these revenge killings.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating concept. I think the whole idea of a Western intervention is that Americans in the forefront, they come in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and they slap an ally on the shoulder and say, you are now with us and we have the same goal. And that's very colonial. They don't have an interest in the past of an Afghan life. That Afghan life is not starting the moment America arrived. Just breaking news, but they have a history. And that history is fascinating and something we don't learn. We do not learn in Western universities, also not at Sciences Po, where we just came from. We don't know about these societies where families and big families still are so powerful and rely on their own family for the future in case of no government and in case of no insurance. So, and the Americans they flew in with the concept of democracy, installed some people in Kabul, and had no eye for this. So I don't know if you want me to explain how this works, like how.
Sure.
Because I think if you have to tell somebody like why did it go wrong in Afghanistan is because of the concept that. First of all, the Taliban, and now we jump, but in 2001, the Taliban had a lot of contact with Hamid Karzai.
Okay.
Yeah, and so when they were toppled by the Americans after 9/11, and Al-Qaeda basically ran off, and the Taliban, under the leadership of Mullah Omar, were in contact with Karzai with letters and letters of surrender. That was a very large part of the Taliban imploding. It wasn't only killing. There was a lot of talking. And yeah, that made that actually Karzai managed to get the top of the Taliban, excluding Mullah Omar, who did not want to have anything to do, who just left and gave the responsibility to somebody else to surrender. And I think that is an historical moment that we need to incorporate in the narrative about what has happened to Afghanistan. So basically you have a war that stops with a peace agreement. Now, is it called a peace agreement? There's a lot of talk about it now. It's called a surrender. The Taliban had given up power and said, let Karzai do the job. Some of them wanted to join. Not everybody. Lots of them went home. Mullah Brother, the top Taliban right now, can tell you tomorrow how he drove back to Dehravut. Once you interview him about this. Very important. So there was no war anymore. If we would be in an ideal world where America, the United States government, would not respond so emotionally after 9/11. So we have now another conflict going on with the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, where Biden tried to calm down his ally Netanyahu and said, suddenly, in a press conference, we were too emotional after 9/11, and it really touched me.
Oh, right, he said that. I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, wow, this is a bit like McNamara in The Fog of War. I don't know if you remember that, where McNamara, after bombing Hiroshima, and said, we made some mistakes. We made some mistakes, but we don't need to be afraid to go to The Hague. We will not be dragged to an international court. And now Biden said this because Netanyahu, of course, acted extremely disproportionate to what happened by Hamas. And we still don't know who killed who, what was friendly fire. We have not a lot of good journalism on that.
And the necessity of going to war after 9/11, it was just the Taliban were willing to talk to you.
Yes.
They were willing to do it, with a neutral mediator. They were willing to hand over OBL. It's just when you hear these reports after, you're just like 20 years of war for what? You could have got what you'd wanted through dialogue. And then you write about it in the book where you're like 20 years later, now they're willing to talk to the Taliban. And you're just thinking how much has been lost, a generation, more than one generation in terms of what you're willing to do now that you're not willing to do then. It's extremely sad, and it comes from, of course, the Taliban was not an easy movement. Mullah Omar was extremely proud. It was also in a bind of we have this is the first Islamic state in Afghanistan, and they were unexperienced, and they came from these villages that I've been in for weeks, and sleeping on the floor, where I would go out of the house of the female area in the morning because I had to do some interviews with my amazing Afghan colleague and friend Najibullah Saib-Sada, and we did go everywhere in the south, but then I left these girls behind.
I mean, these women were sitting in these secluded areas. This was 2000, in the middle of democracy, of the U.S. democracy in the South.
Yeah.
They went once in 2 weeks to the cemetery to meet other women.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that conservatism is very present, and the Taliban has a lot from that, and that brings it now to the main capital, Kabul.
There is one bit in your book which I circled, being like, I absolutely love this story. Was when you were talking about the women and they'd gone into the room and they hadn't seen electricity before, and so they were looking at the light and they were about to turn it off, and she tried to fan it like it was a candle with her veil. I was like, oh my God, I will never forget this story. It was just phenomenal. And it's interesting how the depiction of women lacking agency and all of that stuff, I understand, but it's also a bit like other people cannot understand these women, I think, until you've interacted with them and you've seen the limitations maybe of their life, but also the other ways in which they want to be able to live, or their own inherent conservatism in some ways, because I don't think, like in the tribal areas especially, the women are very strict on other women.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so I think, and it was interesting for me reading that, because I don't remember who wrote Malala's biography with her.
Christina Lamb.
Right, yeah, Christina Lamb.
Nice
and
book.
Really, I haven't read it yet, but I read that she'd written something about how, she also listened to Justin Bieber. And I was like, there's no need to make her more palatable to a Western audience. She can like her own Pashto music. She can be totally unrelatable to me. I still want to hear about her life. And I thought that was
That is exactly the problem. We went in with our coverage, with our own ideas. Not like the news business. There's good books and there's good feature stories. And so we come in and we see these women as victims.
Yes.
And I think that's really neat. We need new education in journalism.
Yeah.
And because how do we otherwise? Let's put it like this. I think ideally in the future, in a utopian situation, it should stop that an American desk with full American coverage of people sends an American to a sensitive situation like this, where we have no connection to anything that has to do with conservatism and being female. We need that needs to stop.
And NGOs were teaching these tribes women abstract art afterwards, and I was like, okay, sure. and also, I think one of the most worrying stories I've ever read about Afghanistan, which, I mean, there are so many, is that they were actually giving warlords Viagra as a form of payment, knowing that they were using that Viagra to rape boys, but these were their allied warlords. And I'm like, that is horrific that you could have ever thought of yourselves as doing anything good for the Afghan people when you were doing something like this.
Yeah, or in the beginning, of course. I have no confirmation on that story, but I do know that working with these men who had such a troubled past by earlier killings they did in earlier wars, the Americans did not want to reevaluate that because they were good killers. And they were living in this concept that there was everywhere Taliban, that there was everywhere Al-Qaeda. So they pumped up these special forces, made them trigger happy, and sent them out with Afghan men who also took that opportunity and say, okay, now I'm a Superman, I have lots of money, I have F-16s who can bomb whatever I want, and I will point the Americans to my rival. And so my rival is dead.
Right.
And the news media was like, another Taliban killed.
Yeah, and it's outrageous to me how these news stories made print without basic verification. And so everyone was just so happy to take that on without, where are your standards of journalism or anything that you hold so dear.
It's very difficult because we after 9/11, we sort of started living in the concept that every terrorism organization was the same. So Hamas was regularly compared with the Taliban. And so monster to monster. So of course a monster is going to behead a baby. We don't check that. And of course the monsters live in this whole Islamic world. And of course the Taliban is killing Westerners. And that whole concept that the Taliban first of all, was not so anti-Western. Second, wanted to become member of the United Nations. Third, surrendered after 9/11. Nuance, nuance, nuance. And so cross-check. You have to stay, despite the emotions that come with war. You need to stay calm. There are enough activists who can run in the streets and demonstrate and tweet and make amazing stuff for one of the parties. But seriously, the journalists, I'm very conservative in this, and we need calmness and cross-checking.
And it's interesting what you say about that, because I don't know if you read Prince Harry's book.
No.
But there is a bit where he's in Afghanistan and he's like, I have. I'm all about gossip, so of course I was like 100% I'm going to read this. It's interesting to read, but the bit where he's in Afghanistan, he's just like, how did I feel about killing them? Well, they're the bad guys, as if it's that easy. But also, I think people would have been more willing to accept that before, but now reading something like that, you're just like, really, were they the bad guys? Like, how can you so easily differentiate between who the good and bad guys are? And now it sounds more farcical to us 20 years after the fact, but it's so hard to have been saying that stuff all along. And now when you look back at the people who were, you're just like, you were right. But in that climate, and we're seeing the same thing in Israel, Gaza now, in terms of how difficult it can be made for you to actually say the things that you want to say.
Yeah, I think that's another thing, another aspect. Of, if you ask me, like, why was journalism on the war on terror, so-called war on terror in Afghanistan, not more journalism? And I think it's not easy to be in my position. I think I spoke to some New York Times correspondents for my PhD who early on in the war figured out that a governor and a local conflict, let's put it like there was a local conflict going on. It's exactly what I call now false reporting. You have an internal dispute. The Americans come and say to the governor, we help you with finding the Taliban. And so before they know, they have killed, 25 people who were each other's rivals, had nothing to do with the Taliban. Now, this correspondent reported this back to New York, and this is the early years after 9/11. So everybody is still emotional and patriotistic, and we are on our side. We are the good ones, and the monsters are over there, including in journalism. And I said, like, why do you believe Afghans? They're all family of each other.
Oh, okay.
And that is not new. We saw that also happening in Iraq after 2003. So the complexity of saying, hey, Americans, you are wrong, the good Mother Teresa doesn't always... Of course, America has proven again and again that it is not the best in a war far away, like Vietnam. And I don't understand why we are not more critical automatically. There's been so much proof that they are also a propaganda machine when it comes to war. Just like the Taliban, just like the Pakistani government, just like the Taliban now. And it's our job to sit in the middle and keep everything at arm's length and say to the Americans, prove it.
And that the need for nuance is there when you need it to be there. So in Israel-Palestine, there's a lot of nuance where you don't need it. It's pretty clear, actually, what's happening. But there, we've got to look at all sides, and we've got to, the bombing of the refugee camp, we were just talking about it because there were 5 different articles on this international law blog looking at it from every angle. And I'm like, if Russia had bombed the Ukrainian refugee camp, please show me any article which would argue that this is a very complex thing and the laws of war can be applied in a few different ways. It just wouldn't. It just wouldn't be there. European journals of international law would definitely not be publishing all of those different viewpoints. It's just the way they choose to see it, they can see it, but where they don't, it is always in their favor.
Yeah, it's we need to indeed. I don't know how it will look like, but I think if you have a more diversified news desk that gives agency to other people who think differently, like the whole China coverage,
right?
For example, can we catch up on that? Because we are also going into a direction that is pretty anti-China, also in our coverage. And that does have an effect on the other. I think also the coverage of us on Afghanistan has had an effect on Afghans, and you at some point. From the president to civilians just in the field, they're like, what is the media doing? And I remember clearly that when I arrived in 2006, there was a lot of respect for us. In 2014, that was completely different. But I think constantly hearing one side of the story on the country you live in, does have an impact.
It was really interesting for me because Osama Bin Laden was found in my hometown, Abbottabad, and so I was reading that from afar. And this is a place that, like my parents now live there, but like where from we go every year. And it was like, oh, this town is actually a village where if you sell a donkey, another person knows about it. And I was like, what? That is not the town I'm from. Like, absolutely not. It's not like a village. You might not know your neighbors. You probably would because it's like a communal town. But it's not what the Western audience was led to believe about Abbottabad. Not to say that it was, completely wrong, which is what, I mean, there's always a grain of truth in this, but it's always like manipulated in some ways. So I thought that even those little bits of reporting about a town I knew, I was like, this is completely wrong.
Right.
So how do you go somewhere like that and then report like that? And then I realized that actually the news media is really skewed. And if I hadn't been from there, I would have been like, this is a tiny town in Pakistan and they should have known and everyone would have known that he was living there. I was like, no one knew that he was there. So I do think that the news media can get a lot down.
What did you think when you heard the news?
I mean, we were completely shocked. There was that guy who was live tweeting about the helicopter crash, and then he found out that he was actually live tweeting that.
Were you in Abbottabad then?
No, I wasn't. But some of my family believed that he was never there. They were like, no, he wasn't. How could he have been here? And stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, they did say that a tall Arab in those parts would have really stood out. And I'm like, not so much in the north. Maybe in like Sindh or so, like you could, you might stand out more, but I don't think he would have stood out that much, or his family would have stood out that much in that part of the world. So yeah, some of my family totally believed that it wasn't true
until today.
Yeah, they would be like, of course he wasn't there. How could he have been in Abbottabad? But I think that's just home team bias. Like,
sure.
They just think he couldn't have been there.
Yes.
So I wanted to end by asking what you think about what's happening in Pakistan currently in terms of the deportation of Afghan refugees. And I know we need to dehyphenate the AfPak issue. I also agree with you on that. But just in terms of how it's been quite horrendous seeing these stories of Afghans being forced to go back from a country that they've lived in for, maybe up to even 4 decades for some of them.
Yeah.
From the Soviet invasion.
True. So I'm not the best one to ask about the nitty-gritty of this. And I hear that it's a next chapter in the relationship between the current government in Afghanistan and the current interim government here in Pakistan, and that it fits a little bit into what I describe in my book, in how they try to influence each other and how they try to have a power and use each other also in a way. And I describe the Taliban before 9/11 as quite stubborn towards Pakistan. The Pakistan government doesn't want Mullah Omar to destroy the Buddha statues, for example. They send delegations.
Right.
The Pakistan government, it sends also a delegation at some point to get Osama Bin Laden out. That also doesn't go anywhere. It's a bit more complex, but that happened also. I also see that in that story of before 9/11, that the Pakistan government and the Taliban government at that time had issues over border activities. There's a lot at that time.
Yeah.
Militants living still as a result of the Soviet fight against communism. There's a lot of, I don't know how many camps, but there's some camps, and there's a lot of talk about who belongs to who is misusing who can stay, who cannot stay, and in this debate, if the Taliban at some point is not doing something which the then government in Islamabad wants, you see that they often use the refugees as a stick. So they say to the then Islamic Emirates, if you don't do this, we'll kick out all the refugees.
Yeah.
It's happened a couple of times, and now this is an escalation. It's a sudden decision. I know that the relationship is not very good. There has been in Afghanistan a lot of sentiment against the Pakistan influence here, and this is the next chapter, and it's unbelievable that this can happen. The world is busy, I guess, with other unbelievable things that happen. The UN is nowhere to stop this.
In many ways.
They're again punishing civilians for something governmental, which is the same, or something which is a group or government responsibility. The same in Gaza, of course, where they punish the civilians for what Hamas did. So the international order has a rough time.
Yeah, completely, and it's quite emotional just seeing their stories about how long they've lived here for and how little they have to go back for. And it's such a shame that they're being used as a pawn by Pakistan to punish the Afghan Taliban currently. But I just hope that something happens in terms of a legal resolution to this. They are entitled to citizenship under our Citizenship Act. The fact that they're not being given it is
also an ongoing problem.
And the fact that the words of the law are so clear. If you're born on Pakistani soil, you're Pakistani. And yet, for the courts to say, but it doesn't apply to refugees, it doesn't say that anywhere. Why would that not have happened at the time of drafting? It's just unconscionable, really, how they've been treated. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but thank you so much. This is such a great discussion, and I hope you've all enjoyed watching this at home.